I don't know if you've ever asked yourself this, but why is free education something that we all aspire for? At least within the US, it wasn't until I think it's mid-19th century in which most of education was just private. Then a bunch of reformers came in and started saying, hey, regardless of your age, religion, where you came from, whatever you want to do in life, education should be free. And not only should be free, but it should be measured by tests, by compliance. Doesn't really matter your kids' needs. You gotta go through this curriculum, this way in which we believe it's the best way for your child to be educated. And of course, with educated meaning whatever definition of education they came up with. And you might be asking yourself, why am I even talking about this if I'm usually talking about ways to grow alternative education companies? And the reason is that we're going through a shift, and the shift basically goes in two ways, I would say. So the first part of the shift or situation, however, a smarter person than me would be able to call it, is that we're going from this model that people see as normal to a model in which, at least within the US, we're seeing growth in homeschooling, micropods, enrichment programs, virtual schools, and all sorts of alternative forms of education that are not only now acceptable, but that are getting incredible results for people. A school in which I was the chief marketing officer at, we were getting kids who were anxious, depressed, suicidal from other schools, and not only they were going through, let's say, the program, but also they were writing novels, making six figures, crafting knives, literally knives, directing music festivals, doing all sorts of incredible things. And like our school, there were there's a growing number of distance learning forms of education. But as this growing number of alternative forms of education happen, then this other issue, this other part of the problem, the state of situation that I see is happening for most of you, which is that this view that educators have that education is not a business and the consequences that come from it are no longer ignorable. And let me start actually with the second part of the issue. A lot of educators I see, they are so aware of their ability to change lives. They've been in Waldorf, Montessori, all sorts of incredible pedagogical methods. They have directed schools all over basically every single continent. They have achieved wonderful things, and they're so aware of that at times that blinds them from the fact that yes, what they're doing might be better than what all other people might be doing, and especially the state might be doing. But regardless of what they think, it's better enough. Open market, made out of private companies. What matters the most is what the market believes. So the funny situation that happens with a lot of alternative education companies that I basically interact with is that the market behaves as the market does. You have supply and demand. If you're a business and you want to stay in business, you've got to make sure that you have enough demand to fund your operations so that you can actually change the lives that you want. But then you have the other side, the problematic side, which is that a lot of educators or people within these enrichment programs, micro schools, virtual schools believe is that because they're so good and so incredible and they have achieved so many fabulous things, they don't have to think about their educational company, as a business. They don't have to think, for example, that a student is a customer. And if the customer bails out, now you lost 1K, 5K, 10K in tuition. They don't think that, yes, flexibility in the ways in which, different teachers teach, it's important. It's something that is worth valuing, but also that if a teacher gives a particular experience, but then another teacher gives a particular experience and both of them clash and a student doesn't love them, then you're getting into a situation in which there's a fragmentation of how the product is experienced. And if this is not accounted for, that student is leaving. And I share these very quick two examples basically to drive the point that now that we're having a market in which there's a growing number of basically companies that can serve the wider market of education within the US, which is just incredible. All I want is for basically people to be able to make choices around the ways in which they're educated rather than the state imposing them. I would hate to see also that increase in companies to be countered by a decrease in companies that are able to survive because they think that because they are so good, the market would say you're incredible, and then they will go out of business. The school can survive regardless of how awful it is. You're not being judged based on your ability to get a kid to be happy or become an author or have the greatest experience in their life. You're usually being judged by your ability to get a kid to get a good score. And you can get a good score while hating school. I did that for, quite a few terms. You can get a great score by being bullied, by being afraid of going to school, by not finding meaning on what you're learning. And that's where the disconnection lies. And that's where the issue lies. We're having an increase in alternative education companies that is not, at least as of right now, happening at the same time that a teaching of how business works and how economics 101 works is being taught to the people that are coming and are used to the public education system, in which you can just ignore parents and you can just ignore students and you can survive. You can still fill up 30, 40, 50 people into a classroom because that's what the state needs you to do, and just go ahead and do it. But here in private, where you don't have unlimited funding, and when the same teacher fucking up twice and leading to 2 students going out, and that contract being valued at, let's say, $30,000, that's $30,000 that you no longer have. And you don't have those $30,000, that's $30,000 less for advertisement, paying for vacations, paying for that teacher, for example. And you get into all sorts of bad situations that I believe more alternative education companies could avoid if they just simply realize what is true regardless of what they believe to be true, which is that if you're private, you are influenced and have to be aware of all the forces of the free market that affect you and influence you regardless of what you think. It's kind of like the struggling artist type of desire that a lot of people have. You can struggle all you want, and it doesn't really matter if you think you're the greatest. You might be the greatest of all time. If you completely ignore the kind of art that the market wants, you cannot demand to get the kind of results that you want. A lot of people from education with good intentions believing that, yes, and I believe this should be true too, which is that they're developing something that is life-changing or potentially life-changing. But just because something can be potentially life-changing doesn't mean that you can ignore basics of business, such as you need a clear offer, you need to communicate it very often, you need the right team to deliver on that offer and to create an experience that it's both aligned with what people wanted and even surpasses it. You need finances, people need to get paid, you need to budget, you need to do all the things that every single business knows that needs to be done, except for education, and partly is because a lot of people in education are influenced by what they experience in public systems. Funny thing at the end of this whole rant is that in economic terms, I think people can agree that, if you ignore what people want, you lose market share, you lose basically your ability to survive and to actually run a business. But in terms of education, the funny situation is that if you as an educator ignore the reality that you're within a free market, you end up kind of with the same system that you're advocating against, which is a system that ignores parents and ignores students for the sake of what you believe they should be valued. Isn't that what we're all fighting for? And isn't that precisely what we're trying to avoid?